At 68 years old, Richard Hayes thought his quiet retirement in Austin, Texas would be filled with simple routines and warm family moments. A retired high school math teacher, Richard had spent 4 decades shaping young minds, always believing that discipline and integrity were the cornerstones of life. After the passing of his beloved wife, Margaret, the home they built together became both a place of memories and a symbol of everything they had achieved. Richard's pride and joy, however, were not his savings or his fully paid-off house. It was his family, his only son Michael, and his granddaughter Emily. A bright teenager with dreams of college, but behind the facade of stability, cracks were forming. Michael, once a responsible young man, had started showing signs of desperation. He had fallen under the influence of his brother-in-law Derek, a smooth-talking schemer with a reputation Richard never trusted. Derek always carried the grin of a salesman, one that never reached his eyes. And Richard instinctively knew trouble followed him. It was during one ordinary morning that the call came, the moment that would unravel Richard's life, Michael's. The voice was urgent, almost frantic. "Dad, I need to see you right away. Derek and I have something important to show you." Richard could never have guessed that this meeting would set into motion a chain of betrayal, deception, and a battle for not just his savings and his home, but for his dignity, his freedom, and the future of young Emily. Richard had always been a man of routine. He liked his morning's quiet coffee in his favorite mug, the newspaper folded neatly, the sunlight spilling across the dining table Margaret once decorated with wildflowers. But that day, the rhythm of his retirement was broken. At exactly 11 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Standing on the porch was his son, Michael, and right beside him, the one man Richard wished he'd never see again, Derek. Tall, thin, with slick-back hair and a smile that felt more like a warning than a welcome. Derek swept into the house like he owned it, his voice loud and cheerful. While Michael trailed behind, avoiding his father's eyes, Richard felt an unease rise in his chest. "What is this about?" he asked, his tone firm. Derek wasted no time. He pulled out a tablet, flipping through glossy images of beaches in Florida. Luxury condominiums, palm trees swaying in the breeze. His words poured out like a salesman at a county fair, an investment of a lifetime, returns guaranteed. The family's future secured. Richard listened, but his eyes were fixed on Michael. His son sat stiffly on the couch, fidgeting with his hands, his face pale. When Derek finally finished his pitch, Richard asked the one question that made the room fall silent. "How much?"
"Oh, yes."
Derek leaned back, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. $200,000. Now, wouldn't you know it? That's almost exactly what you've got in your retirement savings. The words hit Richard like a blow. His savings, the nest egg he'd spent years building, spoken about so casually, like it was already theirs. His jaw tightened. He turned to Michael. "How does he know what I have?" Michael's eyes darted away. "Dad, listen, it's safe. In 6 months you'll have double. Derek has the contacts, the experience," but Richard's patience snapped. "No." His voice was steady, unshakable. "That money is for my old age and for Emily's college. Not for gambling, not for schemes." For the first time, Derek's salesman mask cracked. A flash of irritation crossed his face, quickly covered with another forced smile. "Mr. Hayes, with all due respect, you're letting fear keep you from the opportunity of a lifetime." Richard stood, his hand pointing firmly toward the door. "I've made my decision." Derek gathered his things in silence, but Michael stayed seated.
"Eyes."
His son's expression was not anger, but something we're certain.
Mixed with something darker.
Resentment. When Derek finally left, Michael remained, twisting his hands together, unable to meet his father's gaze. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he confessed, "Dad, I'm in trouble." Richard froze. He'd raised Michael to be careful with money, to live responsibly. But now his son looked like a boy again, nervous, ashamed.
"How much?"
Richard asked, fearing the answer. Michael's lips trembled. 60,000. I borrowed from people I shouldn't have. If I don't pay them back soon. Get dangerous. The weight of betrayal and fear crashed into Richard's chest. His son had not only betrayed his trust, but now dragged their family into the shadows of debt. And yet, when Michael whispered Emily's name, saying he only wanted to protect her, Richard's heart wavered. After a long silence, he made a choice he would soon regret. "I'll give you 30,000, not a penny more. Right. And you'll sign a paper promising to pay it back in monthly installments." Michael's shoulders sagged in relief, but his eyes told another story. Gratitude, yes, but behind it, something Richard couldn't name. That night, Richard lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Margaret's photograph on the nightstand seemed to watch him, her smile calm, her eyes wise. He whispered to her memory, "Did I do the right thing, or did I just open the door to something worse?" The house was quiet, but Richard could not shake the sound of Derek's voice, slick and persuasive, echoing in his mind. Nor could he forget the way Michael avoided his eyes, as if already carrying the weight of another secret. In that silence, Richard realized something. The battle for his future and for Emily's had only just begun. The morning after handing his son $30,000, Richard Hayes expected at least a sense of peace. But instead, a heaviness lingered in his chest. He told himself it was just worry. Maybe Michael would use this lifeline to get back on his feet. Maybe Derek would fade into the background. Good. But deep down, Richard knew the story wasn't over. For a few weeks, things almost seemed normal again. Michael called more often, checking on his father's health, dropping by with groceries, even suggesting doctor visits just to be safe. To outsiders, it might have looked like a devoted son finally stepping up. But to Richard, something about the sudden attention felt staged, rehearsed. As though Michael were reading from a script someone else had written. Then one Tuesday afternoon, Michael arrived with news. "Dad, I found the perfect place for you," he said, his tone rehearsed but gentle. "It's called Golden Horizons. They've got 24-hour medical staff, activities, even a garden you'd love." Richard blinked in confusion.
Michael, I'm
"Fine. Here at home, I cook, I clean, I walk to the library. I don't need to live in a nursing home." Michael smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just come see it. If you don't like it, I'll bring you home right away." Against his better judgment, Richard agreed. After all, he trusted his son, or at least he wanted to. The building was spotless. Its polished floors, cheerful staff, bright paintings on the walls. The director, a neatly dressed woman with a fixed smile, welcomed them warmly. "Mr. Hayes, you'll be very comfortable here. We pride ourselves on dignity and care." Yet Richard noticed things others might have missed. The way some residents sat staring blankly at their plates, the guarded looks in their eyes, the almost too perfect script spoken by the staff. Something in his gut told him this wasn't a place of rest, but a place of control. When the tour ended, Richard turned to his son. "Michael, it's nice enough, but I don't need this. Maybe years from now, but not today." That's when Michael's mask slipped. He cleared his throat and said, "Dad, I've already paid 3 months in advance." Richard's heart sank. "You what?" "Just try it for a week, please. It'll give me peace of mind. You won't be alone if something happens." Richard wanted to protest, but he saw the determination in his son's face, the kind of determination that left no room for debate. Reluctantly, he agreed to 1 week. That evening, as he unpacked a small suitcase Michael had brought without telling him, Richard felt an unease he couldn't name. The room was clean but impersonal, the kind of place where stories ended, not where life thrived. Asterisk, the next morning, his suspicion deepened. He reached for his cell phone, but it was gone. When he asked the nurse, she told him he could only use the communal phone at designated times. By the 3rd day, no call from Michael, no visit. When Richard finally pressed for answers, the receptionist flatly said, "Your son requested no contact this week. He's away on business." As then the director stepped in, papers in hand. "Mr. Hayes, your admission here is permanent. The documents are signed. According to medical records, you've been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. For your safety, this is the best place." Richard's knees almost gave way. "Not true. I am of sound mind. I agreed to 1 week. 1 week." The director's smile turned cold. "Denial is common, Mr. Hayes. Don't worry. We'll take good care of you." That night, Richard sat alone in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The betrayal cut deeper than he thought possible. This wasn't about safety. This was about power. His own son, the boy he raised. The boy he sacrificed for was quietly stripping him of everything: his freedom, his home, his dignity. But Richard wasn't ready to surrender. Somewhere inside him, a voice whispered the same words he used to tell his students before a tough exam: think clearly, stay calm. There's always a solution if you don't give up. Asterisk, what Richard didn't yet know was that salvation would come from an unlikely source, a fellow resident with sharp eyes and a sharper memory. Someone who had seen this kind of betrayal before and wasn't afraid to speak the truth. And with that, Richard's quiet retirement turned into the fight of his life. On his fourth night inside Golden Horizons, Richard Hayes realized sleep wasn't coming. He lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead, listening to the distant shuffle of nurses' shoes in the hallway. His mind kept circling the same haunting question: why would my own son do this to me? The next morning at breakfast, he noticed her. A petite woman with silver hair pulled neatly into a bun, her sharp blue eyes scanning the room with an alertness that stood out among the vacant stares of other residents. When the staff wasn't looking, she leaned toward him and whispered, "You don't belong here." Richard froze. "Excuse me?" She introduced herself quietly. "Imogene Carter. Been here almost 2 years. I work part-time in the laundry, keeps me moving, keeps me sane." She studied him with a knowing look. "I saw the way you walked in last week. Clear eyes, steady steps. You're not sick, Mr. Hayes. You've been placed." Her words cut deep. He lowered his voice. "My son told me this was temporary." Imogene gave a bitter laugh. "They all say that. But I overheard something last night. Your name came up in the director's office. Your son was here arguing about paperwork for a house sale." Richard's chest tightened. His home, the house he and Margaret built, the house filled with 40 years of memories. "Did you hear details?" "Only bits and pieces," Imogene replied. "But I know the pattern. Families bring someone here, get a false diagnosis, and then poof, everything that person owns is suddenly under someone else's control." For the first time in days, Richard felt a spark, not hope exactly, but determination. He leaned closer. "Imogene, can you help me reach the outside world? My granddaughter Emily, she needs to know." Imogene hesitated, then nodded. "Keep an old flip phone in my locker. I'll sneak it to you tomorrow morning, but you have to be careful. They monitor calls." That night, Richard rehearsed what he would say. His hands trembled at the thought of involving Emily. She was only 16, yet she was the one person left he could trust. Margaret used to say, "That girl has an old soul. She sees truth quicker than most." Now Richard clung to that belief. The following day, Imogene slipped him the phone under the table during breakfast. "Battery's weak," she warned, "but it'll work long enough." Richard stepped out to the garden, pretending to admire the roses, and dialed Emily's number. His heart pounded as the line rang. "Grandpa?" Her voice was both shocked and relieved. "Dad said you were in Florida with old friends." "Where are you really?" Richard swallowed hard. "Sweetheart, I'm not on vacation. I'm at a place called Golden Horizons. Your father tricked me into coming here. I can't leave, and they're saying I have dementia." Silence, then Emily's voice shaking. "That's not true. You're sharp as ever." "Grandpa, what are they trying to do?" "They're after the house. And my savings. Listen to me carefully. In my study bottom drawer, there's a blue folder. Inside are the deed, bank statements, even my will. You need to get to it before your father does." "I'll go today," Emily said firmly. "Don't worry, I'll protect it." The call cut off as the battery died, leaving Richard clutching the silent phone. He returned it to Imogene with gratitude, whispering, "You may have just saved me." Later that afternoon, Richard sat in the common room, pretending to play checkers while his thoughts raced. His son's betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about erasing him, declaring him incompetent, stripping away his identity, piece by piece. But now Emily knew. She was his lifeline. And with Imogene's quiet courage beside him, Richard felt a shift. The walls of Golden Horizons hadn't crumbled yet, but for the first time, there was a crack. That night, Before closing his eyes, Richard whispered into the dark, almost as if speaking to Margaret, "They think I'm defeated, but I'm not done yet, not by a long shot." And somewhere down the hall, Imogene's steady footsteps reminded him he wasn't fighting this battle alone. That night, Richard barely slept. Every creak of the hallway doors, every distant sound of footsteps, felt like a reminder that his freedom was no longer his own. But in the midst of his fear, he held on to one truth Emily now knew. His granddaughter was young, but she was brave. And Richard trusted her with all that remained of his hope. The next afternoon, Emily kept her word. After school, she biked straight to Richard's house, her heart pounding. She had always loved that old brick home, the smell of her grandmother's roses still lingering at the front porch. But now the place felt different. She noticed boxes stacked by the entryway, drawers half empty, as if someone had already started stripping the house of its soul. Emily hurried upstairs to her grandfather's study. She pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk and found the blue folder exactly where he said it would be. Inside lay the deed to the house, bank records, and the will Richard had carefully written years earlier. She clutched the folder to her chest, whispering to herself, "I've got it, Grandpa." But before leaving, something caught her eye. On Michael's desk, a stack of papers lay spread open, and curiosity pushed her closer. Her hands trembled as she flipped through them, legal documents bearing Richard's name. At first glance, they looked official. Power of attorney forms. Withdrawal authorizations. The signature? She knew her grandfather's handwriting. This wasn't his. Her stomach turned cold. Her own father was forging Richard's signature. Emily snapped photos of the documents with her phone, her pulse racing, then slid them back exactly where she found them. Long. As she closed the study door, she froze. Footsteps echoed on the porch outside. It was Michael, panicking. Emily slipped out the back door, clutching the folder tightly. She ran across the yard, heart thundering in her chest, and only stopped once she reached the safety of her friend Valeria's house down the street. There she called Richard. This time the line connected long enough for her to whisper, "Grandpa, I found everything, and there's more. Dad's faking your signature. He's trying to take it all." On the other end, Richard pressed the phone close, his voice breaking. "You did exactly what I hoped, sweetheart. Keep that folder safe. Don't tell your father where you've been. We'll need help. Real help." That night, Emily showed the documents to a woman she'd researched online, attorney Linda Marshall. Known in Austin for fighting elder abuse cases, Linda agreed to meet the next morning. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes, the kind of presence that could silence a courtroom. After reviewing the photos and folder, she looked at Emily with steady resolve. "Your grandfather isn't sick. He's being trapped, and your father's actions, those forgeries, are crimes. We'll need to act fast." Emily exhaled a breath. She hadn't realized she was holding. "Can we really stop him?" Linda leaned forward. "Yes, but timing matters. We'll need your grandfather's testimony, independent medical proof of his condition, and evidence of the fraud. You've already given us a strong start." Meanwhile, back at Golden Horizons, Richard kept playing the role of a cooperative resident. He swallowed the pills, but tucked them under his tongue, later slipping them into his pocket. He smiled at the nurses, attended group activities, all while hiding the storm inside him. He'd been a teacher long enough to know, sometimes survival meant waiting for the right moment to solve the problem. That evening, Imogen passed by his table and whispered, "Your granddaughter came through, didn't she?" Richard's eyes softened with gratitude. "Yes, she's stronger than I ever imagined." But for the first time in days, Richard felt something stir inside him, a flicker of hope. Not because the danger was gone, but because he no longer faced it alone. Emily had uncovered the truth. Linda would bring the fight to court. What Michael had counted on his father's silence and isolation was gone. Still, Richard knew his son well enough to fear the next step. When men like Derek and Michael realized they were being cornered, they didn't back down quietly. They pushed harder, grew reckless. Asterisk, as Richard lay in bed that night, he whispered into the quiet room, as if speaking to Margaret's memory once more. "Our granddaughter has your courage. Now it's my turn to stand tall. And with that, he steeled himself for the storm that was surely coming. By the end of that week, Richard Hayes knew he couldn't afford to show a single crack in his disguise. Every morning, he took the pills. The nurse handed him only to hide them under his tongue and slip them into a napkin. Every afternoon, he played along in memory exercises, solving puzzles with deliberate slowness, so no one suspected how sharp his mind truly was. On the outside, he appeared to be the compliant resident they wanted him to be, but inside, he was a man waiting for the right opening. And that opening came through. Emily. She arrived at Golden Horizons on a Thursday afternoon, wearing her school uniform and clutching her backpack like it was a lifeline. At her side was attorney Linda Marshall, whose steady stride and calm authority seemed to command attention the moment they walked through the door. The receptionist stiffened, clearly uncomfortable with their presence, but Linda's voice was calm, professional. "We're here for Mr. Hayes. By law, you cannot deny his right to counsel." Minutes later, Richard was ushered into the small visitors' lounge. The moment his eyes met Emily's, his heart swelled. "Grandpa," she whispered, throwing her arms around him. Richard held her tight, breathing in the comfort of family before glancing at Linda. "You came," he said softly. Linda set a recorder on the table. "Mr. Hayes, I need your statement in your own words. We have to move quickly. Your son has already filed paperwork to declare you mentally incompetent." Richard straightened in his chair, his voice calm but firm. He spoke of the promises Michael had made, the false diagnosis, the way he was locked inside against his will. He described Derek's role, the pressure for money, and the fear he felt when staff tried to medicate him without consent. Linda listened carefully, her pen moving steadily across the page. When Richard finished, she said, "That's enough. For now, combined with Emily's evidence, the forged signatures and financial records, we can present this to a judge tonight." Emily opened her backpack and pulled out the blue folder, sliding it across the table. "I brought everything, Grandpa. The deed, the will, the bank papers. Dad doesn't know I have them." Richard touched her hand, pride shining in his eyes. "You've done more than I ever imagined, sweetheart." But before the moment could settle, the director of Golden Horizons appeared at the doorway, her smile as thin as glass. "I'm afraid time is up. Mr. Hayes needs his medication and rest." Linda didn't flinch. She stood, handing over a business card. "You'll be hearing from me. And in the meantime, if Mr. Hayes is given anything without his explicit consent, you'll answer directly to the court." That night, while Richard lay awake in his narrow bed, Emily and Linda met with a judge on emergency duty. They presented the forged documents, the photographs, and Richard's recorded testimony. By morning, an injunction was signed illegal. Freeze on Richard's accounts and property sales. When Linda returned to Golden Horizons the next day, she leaned close to Richard, her tone firm but encouraging. The judge granted a temporary protection order. "Your son can't touch your money or the house for now." Richard felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly tempered by fear. "For now?" Linda nodded. "We've bought time, not victory. Michael will fight this. He'll bring doctors to say, 'You're sick.' He'll argue you belong here. Our job is to prove the truth before he buries it under lies." Richard closed his eyes, the weight of the fight settling on him. Yet for the first time in weeks, he felt something stronger than fear resolve. He had an ally in Linda, a partner in Imogene, and a granddaughter who carried Margaret's courage in her young heart. Still, as the day wore on, whispers reached him. Staff were suddenly colder, nurses less patient. At dinner, Imogene leaned across the table and murmured, "They know." The director's furious. "You'll need to be twice as careful now." Richard met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Them be furious. For the first time, they're not the only ones holding the cards." That night, as the halls of Golden Horizons grew quiet, Richard whispered to himself, "The tide is turning. They thought they could silence me. They were wrong." And though the battle ahead promised to be long and bitter, Richard Hayes finally believed he stood a chance. 2 mornings after Linda secured the emergency injunction, Richard Hayes was jolted awake before sunrise. The rattle of keys outside his door made his pulse quicken. When the lock clicked open, two large orderlies stepped inside, their voices unusually cheerful. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes. Time to get you ready for transfer." Richard sat up slowly, buying seconds to think. Transfer? To where? One of them smiled stiffly. "Doctor's orders. You'll be more comfortable in our special care unit." Richard knew exactly what that meant, the locked ward downstairs. The place with no windows, where residents who couldn't defend themselves were tucked away out of sight. His breath steadied. If he resisted too strongly, they would use it as proof of instability. He went quietly, he might never get out again. "I need the restroom first," he said calmly. They gave him 5 minutes. Inside the small bathroom, Richard splashed water on his face, then pressed 3 quick taps on the tiny panic button Emily had given him, the lifeline she'd insisted. He'd keep hidden in his pocket. He'd no idea if it would work in time. Minutes. Later, the orderlies escorted him down unfamiliar hallways. The walls were bare now. No cheerful paintings, no flowers, just white plaster and buzzing fluorescent lights. His chest tightened as they opened a heavy steel door and ushered him into a sterile room with a bolted bed and a single chair. "Wait here for the doctor," one of them said, locking the door behind him. Richard sat down, forcing his hands to stop trembling. He thought of Margaret's photo back home, of Emily's determined eyes, of the life he still wanted to live. He whispered to himself, "Stay calm, help is coming." Not long after, the door burst open, not with the doctor, but with attorney Linda Marshall, a police officer in uniform, and a stern-faced court clerk carrying a folder of papers. "Mr. Hayes," Linda's voice rang out, firm and steady. "You're coming with us." The orderlies scrambled, protesting, but the officer held up the injunction. "By court order, this man is under judicial protection. Any further attempt to detain him will be treated as unlawful restraint." Relief flooded Richard's chest, though the sedatives they had been trying to force on him still lingered in his mind. "They were about to move me permanently," he said, his voice hoarse. Linda turned sharply to the staff gathering in the doorway. "That stops today." The judges ordered a full freeze on all actions related to Mr. Hayes' finances and medical care. Every pill, every report, every document will be reviewed in court. The director of Golden Horizons appeared, her composure cracking. "You can't just walk him out." The officer stepped forward. "Watch us." And just like that, Richard Hayes, escorted by law and truth, stepped out of the place meant to bury his freedom. As they passed through the lobby, he caught sight of Imogene Carter standing in the hallway with a laundry cart. Their eyes met, and she gave him a small nod of victory. Outside, the morning air felt like life itself. For the first time in weeks, Richard breathed freely. And then he saw her Emily running across the parking lot, her school bag bouncing at her side. She threw her arms around him, nearly knocking him off balance. "You're safe, Grandpa," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Richard held her tight, his own eyes wet, "Because of you." Linda placed a hand on his shoulder. "We've won the first round, Richard. But your son won't stop here. He'll fight hard, and he'll have lawyers of his own. We need to be ready." Richard nodded slowly. He felt the weight of betrayal pressing down again. But now it was steadied by something stronger, the knowledge he wasn't alone. Emily and Linda were beside him, and the law was beginning to hear his voice. As they drove away from Golden Horizons, Richard looked back at the building one last time, whispered softly, almost as if speaking to Margaret. They thought they could silence me, but I'm still here, and I intend to fight. The courthouse in downtown Austin smelled faintly of old wood and fresh coffee, a mix that seemed to settle Richard's nerves as he adjusted his borrowed navy suit. His friend from the chess club had pressed it into his hands the night before, insisting he'd wear it like armor. And standing there, with attorney Linda Marshall at his side and Emily watching from the gallery, Richard felt that armor wrapping around him, not the fabric, but the support of those who believed in his truth. Asterisk the judge, a sharp-eyed woman, with graying hair pulled neatly into a bun, called the session to order. Her voice carried the weight of authority, but there was also a touch of humanity in it. Richard thought of Margaret for a fleeting second, how she'd always said justice, Takes time, but it always comes. Linda rose first. Her voice was steady, confident, each word chosen with precision. Your Honor, this case is not about an elderly man's decline. It is about a calculated attempt to rob him of his freedom, his dignity, and his life's work. She laid out the story, the sudden push for a nursing home, false diagnosis, the attempt to seize assets. Then came the evidence medical evaluations by 2 independent neurologists who confirmed. Richard's mind was as sharp as any man his. Age. Bank records highlighting suspicious withdrawals. And finally, the photographs Emily had taken of documents bearing Richard's forged signature. The courtroom grew still. When it was Richard's turn, he stood at the witness stand, his hands steady on the rail. He spoke plainly. Without embellishment of the morning, Michael first brought Derek into his home. Of the pressure to hand over his savings. Of the shock of realizing his own son had treated him like a burden instead of a father. His voice caught. Only once, when he mentioned Emily. My granddaughter. She's the reason I'm standing here instead of locked away. She saw the truth when no one else did. Linda placed a reassuring hand on his arm as he returned to his seat. Then Michael took the stand. He looked tired, his once proud posture sagging. His lawyer tried to paint him as a concerned son, a man desperate to protect his aging father. Michael spoke about episodes of confusion, about Richard forgetting things, and about his fears for his father's safety. But when Linda stood to cross-examine, her questions cut through the facade. Mr. Hayes, can you explain why? Your father's signature on this power of attorney looks nothing like his authentic signature? Michael shifted in his seat. He signed quickly. In a hurry, Linda held up a second document. And what about this one? Also hurried. Forged. Asterisk, the tension in the room thickened. And then came the final blow. Recordings uncovered by the private investigator. Derek's voice played clearly through the speakers. Once the old man is declared incompetent, we'll sell the house, transfer the funds, and disappear. Nobody can stop us. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Michael's face drained of color. He muttered something about being misunderstood, but the damage was done. Richard sat silently, watching his son unravel before the world. He didn't feel triumph, only a deep sadness. He remembered teaching Michael to ride a bike, to tie a tie, to dream big. How had they ended up here on opposite sides of justice? The judge finally leaned forward, her gavel resting quietly on the bench. This court recognizes that Mr. Richard Hayes is fully competent to manage his affairs. Effective immediately, all powers of attorney or guardianship filings made on his behalf are void. Furthermore, this court orders a full investigation into the fraudulent activities presented today. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Emily's hand found Richard's, squeezing tight. He exhaled slowly, the weight on his chest easing for the first time in months. Justice wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Michael and Derek would face their own reckoning. But Richard had won back the one thing they had tried hardest to steal: his voice. His freedom. As they stepped out into the sunlight, Richard paused, looking up at the Texas sky. The first time in a long time he felt Margaret there with him, whispering in the wind, "You did it." You stood tall. Courthouse steps felt different that morning, lighter somehow, though the sky above was gray. Richard Hayes stood tall beside his granddaughter Emily, waiting for the final word. Months of hearings, interviews, and depositions had brought them here. Sentencing day, when the gavel fell at last, the courtroom was silent. Michael, Richard's own son, was sentenced to several years in prison for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. Derek, his partner in the scheme, received even more time, his history of fraud in other states coming back to haunt him. Richard sat motionless, staring at the son he once tucked into bed, the boy who used to ask him questions about the stars. Now that same boy sat in chains, eyes full of bitterness and shame. There was no victory in it, only sorrow. As they left the courthouse, Emily slipped her small hand into Richard's. "It's over now, Grandpa," she whispered. He nodded, though. His heart was heavy. "Over in one way," he said softly, "but some wounds don't close easy." The weeks that followed were a strange mix of relief and grief. Richard and Emily returned to the old brick house, though much of it had been stripped bare. Furniture gone, closets emptied, even Margaret's favorite curtains had been boxed up. Yet the bones of the home remained, and together they set about reclaiming it. Neighbors rallied to help. Men from Richard's chess club carried and donated chairs and tables. Emily's friends painted walls and brought photo frames to fill with new memories. Slowly, the house began to feel alive again. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Texas horizon, Richard sat on the porch swing, Emily curled beside him with a blanket over her shoulders. She had been quiet all day. Finally, she asked, "Do you think I'll ever be able to forgive Dad?" The question lingered in the cooling air. Richard didn't answer right away. He thought of Margaret's wisdom, her belief that forgiveness was less about excusing the wrong and more about freeing the heart from bitterness. "I don't know when, sweetheart," he said at last. "But I do believe one day we'll find a way to let go of the anger. For now, it's enough to live free, together." Emily rested her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in months, Richard felt peace stirring in his chest. Life settled into a new rhythm. Richard, though nearing 70, began tutoring neighborhood kids in math again, finding joy in their bright faces and curious questions. Emily threw herself into her studies, determined to honor the trust her grandfather placed in her. Letters came from Michael in prison, long, rambling apologies filled with regret. Richard read them in the quiet of his study, but tucked them away in a drawer. He wasn't ready to share them with Emily yet. Some truths would take time to unfold, but amid the heartache, there were moments of unexpected grace. Sunday, a woman approached Richard, tears in her eyes. "Your story gave me courage," she said softly. "I'm fighting something similar with my brother. Hearing how you stood up, it gives me hope." Richard squeezed her hand, realizing that his struggle had rippled beyond his own walls. One night, sitting again on the porch, Richard looked up at the stars. He thought of Margaret, her laughter, her steadfastness, the life they'd built brick by brick, and he realized something profound. Yes, he had lost a son to greed and betrayal. But he had gained something he never expected: the chance to raise his granddaughter not just as family, but as a partner in resilience. Turning to Emily, he smiled. "We've been through fire, my girl, and we're still standing. That's what matters." She looked up at him with eyes that carried both pain and promise. "As long as we're together, Grandpa, we can handle anything." And in that quiet moment, under the Texas night sky, Richard finally felt the weight lift. The battle had scarred them, but it had also bound them tighter than ever. What was stolen had, in some way, given them a new beginning, one built on truth, courage, and a love that could not be broken. A year had passed since the trial. But for Richard Hayes, time felt both heavy and light. Heavy with the memories of betrayal, but lighter each day with the rhythm of a new life shared with his granddaughter, Emily. The house, once stripped of nearly everything, now carried fresh warmth. The living room walls displayed both old photographs, Margaret's smile frozen in frames, and new ones of Emily at school events, birthdays, and Sunday picnics. It was a patchwork of past and present, proof that even after devastation, life could stitch itself together again. Richard often found himself reflecting in the quiet evenings, sitting on the porch swing with a cup of coffee in hand. The cicadas sang in the Texas twilight, and Emily's laughter drifted out from inside the house. He thought back to those terrifying days at Golden Horizons, the locked doors, the medicated lies, the fear of losing everything. What had saved him wasn't luck or even the law at first. It was the courage of a 16-year-old girl who refused to let her grandfather be erased. One evening, Emily joined him on the porch. She was taller now, her features maturing, but her eyes still carried that same determination. She handed him a letter. "It's from Dad," she said softly. Richard unfolded it with trembling hands. Michael's words spilled across the page: regret, apology, promises of change. For a long while, he just stared at the letter. Then he folded it carefully and set it on the table. "Do you believe him?" Emily asked. Richard sighed. I believe he wants to be forgiven, but forgiveness isn't a gift you hand over in a moment. It's a road you walk slowly, and sometimes the path takes years. Emily nodded, her eyes glistening. I miss who he used to be. I do too, sweetheart, Richard admitted. But we can't live in the shadow of who he was. We live in the light of who we still are. That became his guiding thought in the months that followed. Instead of dwelling on what Michael had taken, Richard focused on what remained and what had been rebuilt. He and Emily planted a small garden in the backyard. They filled the kitchen with the smell of fresh bread, a recipe Margaret had perfected. And Richard reopened his tutoring sessions, filling the house with the chatter of kids solving math problems at the dining room table. Neighbors began to call the place the Hayes house again, not the broken shell it had become, but a living, breathing home. One Sunday after church, a young man approached Richard, nervously holding his hat in his hands. Mr. Hayes, he said, I read about your case in the paper. My sisters and I are worried about our mom. She's being pressured by a relative to sign papers she doesn't understand. Could we talk? Richard agreed, and as he listened to their fears, he realized something. His battle hadn't just saved his dignity, had given others permission to speak up, to fight back against quiet forms of abuse that too often went unseen. That night, Richard told Emily, maybe all this pain had a purpose. If our story helps one more family stand strong, then maybe it wasn't in vain. Emily leaned against him, her voice steady. Grandma would say you turned suffering into strength. Richard smiled, looking out at the wide Texas sky. She always had a way of saying the right thing. The stars blinked above them, and Richard felt an unshakable peace. Life had tested him in the cruelest ways. From his own blood, but it had also shown him resilience he didn't know he still carried. At 68, he had learned that dignity isn't taken unless you surrender it. And family isn't just the one you're born into, but the one who stands beside you when the storm comes. As Emily closed her eyes beside him, drifting toward sleep, Richard whispered the words he wished Margaret could hear. We're okay now. She's safe. And I'll make sure she carries forward the lessons you and I lived by that love. Honesty and courage are worth more than anything money can buy. For Richard Hayes, the battle was never about wealth. It was about protecting legacy, about ensuring that Emily knew she came from a line of strength, not weakness. And in that moment, under the stars, he knew the story of betrayal had become something greater, a story of survival, of hope and of love strong enough to outlast even the deepest wounds. In the end, Richard Hayes' story was not just about betrayal. It was about endurance. His own son had tried to take everything from him, his home, his savings, even his dignity. But what Michael never expected was that love could be stronger than deceit. It was Emily, Richard's granddaughter, who became the light in the darkest moment. Her courage, her quick thinking, her refusal to stay silent, saved not only her grandfather's freedom, but also his legacy. Looking back, Richard realized that money can be stolen, property can be signed away, but the true treasures in life trust, loyalty and love can never be taken without consent. Betrayal left scars, yes, but it also revealed the depth of strength hidden inside him. At nearly 70 years old, Richard discovered he was still capable of standing tall, of protecting the people he loved, and of teaching the next generation. That integrity is worth more than any fortune. Life lesson. Family is not defined by blood alone. It is defined by who stands beside you when the storm hits. We may lose wealth or possessions, but if we hold on to courage and love, no one can strip us of our true worth. If Richard's story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced betrayal and found unexpected strength? I'd love to hear your experiences. If you believe more people should hear stories like this, stories of resilience, love, and hope, please subscribe and join our community. Together we remind the world that it's never too late to stand tall.